Have you ever imagined what happens when the perfect husband turns out to be the worst financial traitor? Not to another woman, but to his own father-in-law. A horse-riding love affair and betrayal from the closest people turn a family's life into a never-ending nightmare. What happened, and what will be the consequences when the truth is revealed? The story begins in a small town called Maplewood, where Rose and David Hawthorne build their family life. They met as high school students at Maplewood High, where Rose was a beautiful and intelligent girl who always stood out in extracurricular activities, while David was an active boy with a passion for sports, especially soccer. The connection between the two began through their participation in volunteer activities at the school and gradually developed into a sweet love. After graduating, they decided to get married and stay in the small town where they grew up. Rose continued to pursue a career in education and became a teacher at the same high school where she studied. She quickly became loved by the students thanks to her enthusiasm and passion for the profession. David, after a period of working in the construction industry, decided to open a small company specializing in the design and construction of houses. With talent and determination, David quickly built a reputation in the Maplewood community. They bought a quaint house on Chestnut Street, a quiet and traditional part of town. Their home, with its classic architecture mixed with modern touches, became a source of pride for both of them. Rose decorated the house with self-painted landscapes, while David took care of every detail of the house from the construction projects he had participated in designing. Their life seemed perfect to everyone around them. They often held small parties with friends and colleagues, where everyone could admire their success and happiness. However, beneath the surface of this perfection, tensions began to appear when Rose and David faced difficulties in having children. After years of trying without success, they began to feel pressured and disappointed. She still could not forget the pain of her previous failed pregnancy. That loss haunted her every night, and not being able to have another child only deepened the pain. David used to be her comforter, but now he became distant, and Rose felt completely alone. Rose finds herself increasingly alone in her own home. David becomes more distant, spending more time at work, while Rose seeks comfort in the students she loves. Their relationship begins to show obvious cracks. During this time, Rose began to spend more time with her father, Benjamin Grant, a man in his 60s who was still handsome and elegant. Benjamin was a successful businessman but had retired and now lived alone in an old house on the banks of the Maple River. After the death of his wife, Benjamin became lonely and often sought companionship from his daughter. Rose, sensing her father's loneliness, visited him often and spent time talking to him. While Rose found comfort in her father, David was surprised by the empathy Benjamin showed him. At first, it was just small talk, but gradually David realized that Benjamin could understand and listen to the problems he was facing. Benjamin, with his experience and wisdom, became someone with whom David could share his deepest thoughts, something he could not do with anyone else, including Rose. One autumn evening, while Rose was busy with schoolwork, David decided to visit Mr. Benjamin alone, under the pretext of checking in to see if he needed any help. Mr. Benjamin, though a little surprised by David's appearance, was still happy to welcome him with a warm smile and an invitation to walk around the backyard. In the quiet space, amid the changing autumn leaves, David began to share about the pressures and stresses of his married life. Mr. Benjamin listened with understanding and sharing, creating a connection that neither of them expected. From those conversations, the relationship between David and Mr. Benjamin grew deeper. Rose, still unsuspecting at this time, even felt reassured knowing that her husband had someone to confide in and relieve stress. David's visits became more frequent, and before long, they began to spend time doing activities together, from home repairs to gardening together. Sometimes, after tiring working hours, they sit together in the quiet garden, watching the newly blooming flowers, talking about life, past dreams, and remaining regrets. At first, David felt comfortable just having an older person to listen to and share with, someone with deep knowledge and rich life experience. However, each time they met, Mr. Benjamin not only listened but also gave sharp, sometimes profound advice, making David feel understood and even admired Mr. Benjamin. As they discussed life issues together, David gradually realized that he began to seek Mr. Benjamin's presence more and more, as if he no longer felt complete without those conversations. One afternoon, after finishing a small construction project, David sat with Mr. Benjamin on the porch, looking out at the Maple River sparkling in the sunset. They were silent for a long moment before Mr. Benjamin placed his hand on David's shoulder, a gentle but meaningful gesture. "David," he said, his voice deep, "there are things in life that you can never fully grasp, but you can choose to live with that sentence resonated in David's heart, making him feel a strong and inexplicable connection with me. One day, while they were repairing Mr. Benjamin's old roof together, a small collision occurred, and both realized that they were more than just two friends. David, by accident, grabbed Mr. Benjamin's hand to keep his balance while repairing. The gentle touch lasted a little longer than usual, and when their eyes met, there was a spark that neither of them could deny. Mr. Benjamin felt his heart beat faster, a feeling he had not remembered for a long time. His eyes met David's, and in that moment, all reason seemed to disappear, giving way to a deep and incomprehensible emotion. It was not just admiration, but a feeling mixed with desire and fear. He knew this was wrong, knew that it would lead to unforeseen consequences, but he still could not help but feel it. After that day, the atmosphere between them began to change. In subsequent encounters, both felt an underlying tension, as if they were walking a thin line between propriety and temptation. Mr. Benjamin began to notice a change in the way he looked at David. Every time they met, he couldn't help but feel his heart flutter. The feelings he had tried to bury deep inside him now rose up like a smoldering fire inside him. He wondered how he could let them grow. But even though he knew he should stop, he couldn't help but crave David's presence. He found himself looking forward to their encounters, searching for reasons to keep David around longer, and his eyes gradually held more understanding a suppressed longing, a feeling he both feared. David, despite being well aware of the dangers of this relationship, is unable to resist the attraction of Mr. Benjamin. Mr. Benjamin realizes that David is experiencing similar feelings. Their interactions become complex and full of hidden meanings. Every time he is near David, he feels like he is on the verge of making a wrong decision. But the temptation is too strong. He knows he should keep his distance, but every time he thinks about it, his heart aches. He is torn between his responsibility as a father and the intense emotions he cannot control. One evening, after a few drinks, David and Mr. Benjamin sit together in the small living room. The atmosphere in the room becomes heavy as the conversation gradually dies down, and silence takes over. In an uncontrollable moment, David leans towards Mr. Benjamin, and they share a gentle but passionate kiss. It was a moment they both knew shouldn't have happened, but one they couldn't stop. After that, they sat silently together, neither of them saying a word. Both of them understood that they had crossed a line that could not be turned back, and the relationship had entered a new phase where prohibition and passion intertwined. David began to find ways to be with Mr. Benjamin more, even using work as an excuse to avoid going home. Mr. Benjamin also became conflicted between maintaining his relationship with his daughter and his growing feelings for David. Both of them knew that they were playing with fire, but their desire and feeling of being understood made them unable to stop. Each time they met, they got closer to the edge of danger, but they could not resist the whirlwind of emotions they were experiencing. This relationship had crossed the line of friendship, becoming a dangerous and forbidden love, but Rose had not yet realized this. Meanwhile, Rose began to notice subtle changes in David's behavior. He was often absent from home at odd hours, always making excuses about being busy at work or needing to help Mr. Benjamin with chores. When he did come home, David seemed distant, not as communicative as he had been before. Rose couldn't help but wonder if something was going on, but she convinced herself that it was probably just the stress of work and the fact that they couldn't have children. She also knew that David and Mr. Benjamin were growing closer, but Rose just thought that this was normal, even a good thing. However, the little signs Rose noticed couldn't be ignored. She began to notice details she might have missed before, the change in the way he answered the phone, and the way he seemed to dodge when she asked him what he was doing while at Mr. Benjamin's. Rose felt uneasy, but she didn't want to believe that the husband she loved could betray her. One afternoon, when Rose returned home earlier than usual, she found David sitting alone in the living room, looking pensive and absent-minded. When she walked in, he was startled, as if he had been caught thinking about something. When Rose asked him what he had been doing all day, David only gave vague explanations, saying that he had helped Mr. Benjamin fix something around the house. However, the awkwardness in his answer could not escape Rose's sensitivity. Rose's suspicions grew, and she decided to start observing David's behavior more closely. She noticed that he often went out under the pretext of meeting Mr. Benjamin, but when she asked for details about what they had done, David's answers were always very brief and lacking in specifics. She also began to notice that David came home looking tired. His clothes were not as neat as usual, and other signs of fatigue that she had never seen before. Every time he returned home from visiting Mr. Benjamin, David seemed restless, his eyes averted when Rose gently asked him what he had been doing. She also began to notice that David was absent for strange periods of time without explanation, and whenever she suggested going with him to visit her father, David would find a way to avoid it or make up some excuse for her not to go. The long nights passed in silence, Rose lying next to David but feeling the distance between them growing, as if he were a distant presence that she could not reach. Her mind began to fill with unanswered questions. Was it the pressure of not being able to have children that made the man she once loved and knew so well become so distant? Or was there some dark secret he was hiding? The feelings of loss and doubt gnawed at Rose's mind, like a simmering undercurrent that she could not ignore. However, Rose still tried to stay calm, not wanting to make a big deal out of it without any clear evidence. Finally, on a Saturday afternoon, Rose decided to pay a surprise visit to her father's house. She had spent the morning at school preparing for the student literature exhibition and felt the need for some quiet time with a cup of tea with Mr. Benjamin to clear her mind of the dark thoughts. But as she approached his house, her heart stopped when she saw David's car parked outside. She told herself that David had probably just come to help him as usual, but deep down, a bad feeling began to creep in. Rose walked slowly to the front door, trying to keep her footsteps quiet. When she opened the door and stepped inside, the sight before her eyes was unbelievable. On the sofa, David and Mr. Benjamin were hugging each other in an intimate position, completely unaware of her presence. Mr. Benjamin's hair was disheveled, and David's shirt was disheveled. On the coffee table, 2 half-empty glasses of whiskey stood as silent witnesses to the betrayal. Rose felt as if the world around her was collapsing, and she could not contain the anger that flared up inside her. She couldn't believe that the relationship between David and her father could have developed to other than this extent, and that she had been so cruelly deceived. Pain and anger welled up in Rose's heart, making her feel like she had nothing left to lose. When she faced the terrible truth, the feeling of betrayal not only by her beloved husband but also by her most trusted father, Rose was overwhelmed by a wave of anger and pain. In a moment of rage, Rose walked into the room, her eyes filled with anger and pain. Not only did she see David and Mr. Benjamin sitting close to each other, but she also discovered a letter in Mr. Benjamin's pocket. This letter was written by David, in which he expressed his regret for loving Mr. Benjamin too much and not being able to return to a normal life. Rose held her breath as she read those words. She couldn't believe that the feelings between them had developed to this extent. She faced David and Mr. Benjamin, demanding an explanation of what was happening. Both men were stunned, their faces filled with guilt and confusion. David stuttered, trying to come up with meaningless explanations, while Mr. Benjamin could only bow his head, unable to face his daughter's pained eyes. Rose began throwing things around the room, breaking everything she touched. She screamed, demanding that they tell the truth, but no words were enough to ease the pain in her heart. Rose felt her heart being torn apart, not only by the betrayal of her husband whom she had loved for so many years, but also by the betrayal of her father whom she trusted the most. Images of Mr. Benjamin hugging and kissing David, of the secret dates between the two that she had overlooked, all came back, drowning her in unbearable pain. The lies, the secrets they had kept from her for so long were like knives stabbing deep into her heart, making her feel like there was nothing left to hold on to. She walked into David's office, where he kept a gun in a drawer for protection after a string of burglaries in the area. In a moment of confusion, she took the gun, feeling its cold weight in her hand. Her eyes were determined, no longer hesitant. Rose could think of anything but the pain and anger burning inside her. She felt like she was falling into a nightmare with no way out, a nightmare that only blood could erase. When David returned home that evening, he didn't notice the change in Rose's demeanor until it was too late. When he entered the living room, Rose was standing there, her eyes cold and her gun in her hand. David froze, his eyes wide with horror as he realized what was happening. He tried to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but every word he spoke was like pouring fuel on the fire. Rose could no longer hear anything, David's voice becoming meaningless before the betrayal she had suffered. In a moment of rage, Rose pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out deafeningly, shattering the silence of the house. David fell to the floor, his eyes filled with shock and pain. Blood poured from the wound in his chest, staining his white shirt. Rose stood still, watching her husband fall, unable to believe what she had just done. It felt like everything was over, but at the same time the horror of her actions hit her. In that moment, all Rose could think about was emptiness. She had lost everything, her husband, her father, and herself. She dropped the gun, hearing the metal hit the hardwood floor in the eerie silence of the house. Rose stood still, watching her husband fall motionless on the floor, realizing that her life would never be the same again. With shaking hands, Rose finally reached for the phone and called for help, her voice cracking as she begged them to come quickly. As she knelt beside David, pressing her hands to his chest to try and stop the bleeding, remorse and fear flooded her. What had once been love and trust was now regret and pain. But her pain had become an indelible reality. As the paramedics arrived and loaded David onto a stretcher, Rose could only stand there, feeling as if she were caught in a nightmare she could not escape. Neighbors, drawn by the sound of gunfire, gathered outside the house, their eyes filled with fear and curiosity as they took in the horrific scene before them. The ambulance's headlights reflected off the windows, like the last light in a darkness Rose could no longer recognize. David was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, but survived after several surgeries. However, the bullet had severely damaged David's spine, leaving him permanently disabled. He faced a life in a wheelchair dependent on others for his most basic needs. David, once a confident and successful man, was now a shadow of himself. While Rose was incarcerated and preparing for the trial, David filed for divorce. However, the separation brought him no relief. David's life became lonely and filled with pain, not only physically but also mentally. He was haunted by the image of Rose, by memories of his broken marriage, and by the betrayal he had caused. With each passing day, David fell deeper into depression, no longer finding a purpose in life. Mr. Benjamin, who had contributed to this tragedy, withdrew completely from public life and lived as a recluse in his small house, weighed down by regret and guilt. He could not bear the burden of what had happened. The memories of his relationship with David and his betrayal of his daughter haunted him every day. The torment became unbearable, and with each passing day he felt himself being gradually swallowed by the pain he could not erase. One dark night, Mr. Benjamin decided that there was no other way to escape this nightmare than to end his life. He left a final letter, apologizing to Rose and hoping that she could forgive him, although he knew it was almost impossible. At trial, Rose was sentenced to 3 years in prison for intentional injury, with the possibility of parole after 1 year. Although the sentence was not too harsh, the pain and regret still haunted her. During the long, lonely nights in prison, Rose was haunted by memories of her broken family and what she had lost. One day, she received a final letter from her father, who had taken his own life in the empty house. His words, full of regret and apology, stabbed Rose's heart like a knife, making the pain unbearable. At that moment, she realized that all hope of forgiveness and reconciliation had vanished, leaving her with an endless emptiness.